What started as nothing but a pamphlet in 1991 would become a massive franchise 3 decades later. Yup, Hellboy was first envisioned by creator Mike Mignola in a pamphlet, and now it has 4 live-action movies, several comics, and even a couple animated features. While fans mostly know about Hellboy from the live-action films, there are many interesting things that remain obscure, and that's exactly what we're going to bring to light in this video. 25 insane facts about Hellboy. But before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now, let us begin. Hellboy's personality was based on creator Mike Mignola's father. We know for a fact that Hellboy can take a few hits. A lot of hits, in fact. I mean, his demon anatomy comes into play and he does wonderful things with it, but despite his strength and durability, he's faced enemies who are equally durable and powerful, and clashes with these guys have resulted in some really horrible and bloody fights. From being punched and shot to being stabbed and thrown down from high-rises, he's faced it all, but always finds the motivation to keep his head cool and his spirits high. You might think he's gone down for good, but then comes a crisp, dry humor comeback you weren't expecting, and this no problem is too big attitude comes to Hellboy from Mike Mignola's dad, after whose personality he based Hellboy's personality. Mignola's father was not into some white-collar job where he could sit behind a desk and spend the day. This man was a cabinet maker. More often than not, he would have stories of accidents which ranged from trivial to terrible. However, Mike Mignola's old man always had an unusual calmness on his face when he described the details of his accidents, even the gory details. He had an aloof manner about him, and Mignola ensured that his super cool dad was introduced to the world in part through Hellboy's unflappable attitude. Additionally, Mignola's father had fought in the Korean War. He traveled the world and was, according to Mignola, a been-there, done-that kind of guy. Again, Hellboy has also fought many battles and has traveled the world in the comics, from Africa to England, and there are only a few places that Hellboy has not landed his hooves upon. Professor Trevor Brutinholm does not have a huge role in the comics. Since we're on the subject of fathers, let me tell you another fact. This one's about Hellboy's father figure, Professor Trevor Brutinholm, who got Hellboy as a child when he was found off the coast of Scotland by a group of soldiers. The professor knew that a spawn of hell could bring about a destiny dreaded by one and all, but he took the youngling under his care and raised him as a man who would challenge his evil destiny and work for the cause of humanity. Eventually, Hellboy became an agent of the BPRD. We know all of this about Hellboy and Professor Trevor Brutinholm, but not many know that the man who took in Hellboy didn't live for long in the comics. Please note that we're not talking about the spin-off comics, we're talking about the main series. Nevertheless, Professor Brutinholm dies in the first volume, titled Seed of Destruction, and from then on, he makes his appearances only in flashbacks. Additionally, his death came at the hands of some very nasty frog-like demons who pretty much sucked the very life out of Professor Brutinholm. Unfortunately, the comics don't really dive deeper into his death or its toll on Hellboy. I mean, he does acknowledge it, but the real impact of Professor Trevor Brutinholm is shown in the movies. We believe Guillermo del Toro made a cinematic choice to focus a tad bit more on the Professor, but we wouldn't have had a problem with him having a slightly larger role in the comics as well. The original vision for Hellboy was starkly different, and the story behind his name. Mike Mignola was not always a comic book writer, and when he wasn't writing, he was creating art. The story goes back to 1991, more specifically the first ever Great Salt Lake Comic Con. A pamphlet for the same had a sketch by an artist for hire, and the artist was Mignola. This sketch was of a monster, a hairy dude kinda like Desmodu from Dungeons & Dragons. The creature looked almost caveman-like and had 4 horns, 2 of which were cut off. He also had a couple of feathery wings and, for some unknown reason, a fish and a crab around his belt. Don't ask why, it was the way it was. Now, on the belt, Mignola had written the words Hellboy, kinda like a dog tag, a crude, hellish version of a dog tag. This early Hellboy also had a few weapons and ornaments spread across his visage. There also seems to be a vulture sitting on his left shoulder. We're not so sure how this version would have worked out as far as the character's popularity is concerned, but what do you think? While you consider that, let me also tell you the secret behind Hellboy's name. So coming back to the belt, Mike had initially left the space in the center of the belt empty and only came up with the name as a last-minute thought. In his interview with Christopher Irving, Mike said, and I quote, "I'd never really given any serious thought to doing and certainly not writing my own comic. I'd done this drawing for a convention and written Hellboy on it as the last thing. I've done this drawing with a blank space on his belt that I wrote it on. I thought it was funny, but wasn't serious about doing anything with it." Many heroes died, so that Hellboy could live. After having his piece featured in that fateful pamphlet in 1991 at the Great Salt Lake Comic-Con, Mignola started developing the character. Needless to say, the initial vision and theme of Hellboy comics were far different than what we know and see today. Sometime after the Comic-Con, his character was to be featured on the cover of an Italian magazine called Dime Press. For this, Mignola revised his character a bit. By now, the Hellboy we know was beginning to shape, although Mignola had not yet given the character his red skin or the BPRD clothing. From here on, Mignola really invested his time into developing the comic around Hellboy, but as the writer describes in the last few pages of Hellboy, Seed of Destruction, he did not initially want the comics to be centered around a single hero. In fact, he wanted a team of superheroes who had all sorts of paranormal origins and powers. He even developed initial art pieces featuring all the members of the team, including the amphibious BPRD agent Abe Sapiens. But the writer started facing certain creative issues, such as coming up with the names for all these characters, so he decided to cull the other superheroes and focused only on Hellboy. Having said that, several elements from his initial concept art landed in the final version. For instance, Abe Sapien and the BPRD logo. We're also sure that several abilities of the other superheroes that Mignola imagined but couldn't name found their way into the Hellboy mythos. Creatively, that seems plausible, don't you think? But what about the first ever Hellboy comic? Where was that published? First appearance of Hellboy. So Mignola's idea really came to life in 1993 at the San Diego Comic-Con, 2 years after the Great Salt Lake Comic-Con. In these 2 years, Mignola had developed his initial idea and it was ripe for people to enjoy. The first appearance of Hellboy came in the pages of an exclusive comic book handed out to patrons at San Diego Comic-Con, and the issue itself was called SDCC Comics No. 2. It featured a short black and white story just 4 pages long. Here, Hellboy somehow arrived at this super creepy and abandoned gas station only to bump into a creepier dog. Interestingly enough, the dog was actually Anubis, the ancient Egyptian god of mummification. Like most of his stories, Hellboy uses his brain and brawn to defeat Anubis, and the story ends with an explosion at the gas station. John Byrne was a co-writer for this comic, and it was the first time that we got to see Hellboy in his iconic trench coat. The 4-page story did well to introduce Hellboy as a character, his way of thinking, and his personality, but most importantly, the kind of villains he was set to face in the years to come. If you want a colored version of the story, you can find it at the back of the first volume of the Hellboy series. About the trench coat, Mignola later said, and I quote, "I wasn't much concerned with the plot, but I did learn a couple of things. Hellboy looks better with a coat, and I like to draw gorillas with big bolts sticking out of them." Writing this script has made us realize that the whole process of Hellboy's birth and journey took shape one event at a time. His girlfriend. If there's a human flamethrower in the Hellboy comics, it has to be Liz Sherman, and I know you'll not disagree with that. While the Hellboy films have pitted the 2 BPRD agents together and Liz was given a bigger role, the comics tell a different story, where she was more of a good friend or even something of a sister to Hellboy. Yup, the movie upgraded her from a sister-like figure to a potential love interest, so much so that they are even expecting twin children. I mean, they were at the end of the second movie, but since a 3rd installment in Del Toro's supposed trilogy is never gonna happen, we can all breathe a sigh of disappointment. But anyways, we digress. In the comics, Hellboy had another girlfriend, and many people are unaware of this. Her name was Alice Monaghan, and the 2 of them first met in a story called The Corpse. It does get kinda weird though, because when Hellboy first met Alice, she was just a baby, and he had rescued her from fairies. 50 years pass, and Ms. Monaghan carries on with her own life, while Hellboy spends his time doing Hellboy stuff. They meet again half a century later in the story called The Wild Hunt, where the 2 start seeing each other. I initially said it was weird because, you know, she was just a baby when he rescued her, and he must have been at least a couple of decades older than her. Nevertheless, it had the possibility of working out between them because Alice also had a slowed aging factor, possibly because she spent a lot of time among fairies. Unfortunately though, the 2 of them couldn't do much about their relationship because Hellboy meets his end at the end of the series. But before his death, they had decided to go to the US and start their lives together. Interestingly, the creative choice made by Del Toro to bring Hellboy and Liz together was the result of his fascination with strange creatures falling in love with human women, and that's exactly what earned him a couple of Oscars for his film, The Shape of Water.
All I wanted was revenge until I saw you. You can usher in the
The son of a witch is the rightful king of Britain. Even if you don't know his name, his appearance will tell you that Hellboy is a demon, and the name makes it super obvious. However, there are several who don't know that he is half human instead of being all demon. Yep, his mother was named Sarah Hughes, and she came from this long line of witches. Sarah was just a 16-year-old girl when something in her mind flipped and she sought powers from the demon Azael, the Lord of Witches and Hellboy's old man. It was April 30th, 1574, and Hellboy was conceived within Sarah Hughes' soul on that fateful night. Yeah, that's right, he was conceived within her soul and not her body. As Sarah grew older, she became more sensible and found God, naturally, so she gave up her witchy ways, repented for all the sins she committed, and also the deals she made with demons. Later in life, she got married, and the two of them made beautiful babies, one of whom became a monk, the other a nun. That's quite a turnaround, given where Sarah Hughes started. Anyways, while Sarah breathed her last, she asked her children to help her soul and keep Azael from taking it after she died. But being a nun and a monk doesn't mean you can stop a demon from taking your dead mom's soul, and the children failed. As soon as Sarah's soul left her body, Azael claimed it, but out of this soul came Hellboy. So that's what makes him the son of a witch, but what even fewer fans know is that Sarah Hughes actually belonged to the royal family. You see, she was actually a descendant of the child produced by King Arthur and his half-sister Morgan Le Fay. Over the centuries, rules of succession and royal family deaths paved the way for him to become the true king of Britain. In fact, Morgan Le Fay, his ancestor, appears before him in Volume 9, The Wild Hunt, to reveal to him about his claim to the throne and also give him Excalibur, the famed sword of King Arthur. He initially says that he wants nothing to do with the kingship, but eventually comes to terms with the status quo and pulls Excalibur out from where it was resting to finally claim his birthright as the King of Britain. The meaning behind his name. If you've watched the films or read the comics, you've probably heard the name Anung on Rama, Hellboy's real name. But do you know the true meaning of Hellboy's iconic alter ego? Well, it roughly translates to, and upon his brow is set a crown of flames. The crown of flames basically refers to the fact that he would become the ruler of hell and be the one to bring about the apocalypse to the entire world. In a story called Wake the Devil, Rasputin reveals to Hellboy his real name and its meaning. In fact, the volume was also the basis of major plot points in the first Hellboy movie. I'm sure you remember the scene where he decided to break his horns and reject his fate. Well, that's straight from the Wake the Devil story. Sadly enough, Hellboy can do all he wants, but he cannot escape his destiny. Across the comics, he has tried to evade that destiny and ensure that he can avoid his past and what his past could do to his future, but that's no walk through the park. In the final volume, called The Storm and the Fury, he fights the armies of hell so that an apocalypse is averted, and guess what? He succeeds, although the cost of that success was too huge. Hellboy lost his life as well as his soul and is right now in hell wandering. At least that's the current status after Mignola's 2016 addition to the series, Hellboy in Hell. Guillermo del Toro was already a Hellboy fan before he made the movie. More often than not, directors who grew up reading comics end up making better sci-fi or fantasy movie than those directors who didn't read comics as children or young adults, and that makes total sense to us. As for Guillermo del Toro, he says that he was flipping through comic books before he could even learn how to read them. Needless to say, that love for comics found its way into his young adulthood. It was during his 30s that he discovered Mike Mignola and found himself slowly becoming a fan of his work. So much so that he named Mignola for visual influences, among others like Richard Corbin, Bernie Wrightson, and Will Eisner. In the recording of the Hellboy Director's Cut commentary track, Del Toro said this about the Hellboy creator: "Mignola, in my later years, already as a young adult, fascinated me with his use of light and shadow, with his amazing bold line work, but also with the way he gave birth to my favorite superhero in my adult years, which is Hellboy." In fact, when the two of them met during the pre-production days of the first Hellboy movie, they bonded over their love for stuff like Pulp Fiction and folklore. Not surprisingly, their first choice for the actor to play the lead in this movie was also the exact same. Hellboy sighting interviews. In the Hellboy universe, he's seen as something of an urban legend, a myth, or at best a tabloid story. You can think of creatures like the Bigfoot or Wendigo. to put more value into this idea, the film's opening credits roll out newspaper headlines, blurry photos, and grainy videos, and there are also several eyewitness accounts of the people who claim to have seen Hellboy in action. When Rupert Evans's Agent Myers sees him for the first time, he can't help but exclaim, "He's real." This proves that Hellboy's existence is a big deal, and that's why everyone is trying to keep it under wraps. Now, this whole thing was supposed to play out differently and on a grander scale in the film. According to the early drafts of Hellboy, there were supposed to be eyewitness interviews of people who saw the half-demon, and these interviews would have told parts of the story. Unfortunately, though, the studio executives did not fully come aboard with this idea, and Del Toro didn't fight it because it wasn't impacting the story in any major way. However, that doesn't mean he cowed down every time he had a difference of opinion with the studio. You see, he had to fight hard enough to ensure that Hellboy didn't become just another Hulk. How? Let's find out in the next entry. They wanted to turn him into a Hulk. Now, it was evident from the very beginning that Hellboy, as a movie, was to face several hurdles to come to life. You know how studio executives are and how often they fight with directors and writers to get what they want. Sometimes the influence and control is of such a magnitude that directors leave projects midway or right before filming concludes. Anyways, the point is, Hellboy had to face similar issues. The problem is somewhat evident. The movie's main character has Hell in his name, and while that couldn't really be dropped, the studio wanted to change how the main guy looked. They didn't want the Hellboy to look like he was from hell. I mean, what the hell's up with that? So they suggested that Hellboy should look like a normal human being who owned a red hellhound. The only catch was that he would turn into his monstrous form when someone or something made him angry, kind of like Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk. This change would have altered the very essence of Hellboy and reduced him to a copy of Marvel's Hulk. Of course, Del Toro didn't agree to this disastrous suggestion and stuck his ground, and the studio had to cave in. Hellboy was betrayed by the BPRD, sort of. It may seem to movie fans that Hellboy and the BPRD were inseparable, but in the comics, he leaves the division pretty quickly, and more precisely, he stays with the BPRD for less than half of the original series. So there are 12 volumes of Hellboy, and close to the end of the story called Conqueror Worm, Big Red decides to part ways with his colleagues, and this happens on account of two reasons. The first reason is how the organization treated his close friend named Roger. So, Roger's story starts in Hellboy Volume 2, Wake the Devil, in which he's found in the ruins of Kazef Castle within an alchemical lab. Roger was basically a homunculus, which means a human created artificially using herbs and blood. So it's like a robot, but organic and made using alchemy and magic. After Hellboy meets Roger, they bond over their strange origins and become fast friends. Soon, Robert even joins the BPRD as an agent. But you know how government organizations usually function. They started their own experiments on Roger, so much so that they stuffed explosives within him during a mission. Hellboy couldn't stand this treatment of his friend and decided to pack his things. In fact, we actually saw Roger in the movie. During the scene when Professor Brutinholm shows Myers the insides of BPRD, we see this grayish male humanoid statue that has a huge ring on its groin. That's Roger. The second reason, which served as another giant catalyst, was that Hellboy now wanted to find himself. By this point, he had learned about his destiny and his origin and wanted to find answers to the burning questions he had in his mind. He decided he would no longer avoid these questions because embracing them was the only way to figure out how to take care of his destiny. He resigns and sets off for Africa to explore. All about Good Samaritan. In the first Hellboy movie, Guillermo del Toro gives the audience a weapon that's more than just firepower. The Good Samaritan, Hellboy's primary sidearm, is as much a tool of faith and folklore as it is a revolver. This 10-pound, 4-shot, 22mm cannon is built to end things, especially things that don't belong to the realm of the living. The gun's grip is carved from fragments of the true cross, the same one that Christ was crucified upon. As for the rest of it, the metal comes from holy relics, Irish church bells, blessed silver, and cold iron from crucifixes. So every inch of this weapon carries some kind of divine intent, almost as if it were forged for the express purpose of putting monsters down. Hellboy doesn't trust factory rounds either. He makes the ammo himself by mixing ingredients like white oak, garlic, silver shavings, clove leaves, and holy water. each tailored to wound different kinds of supernatural creatures. Some bullets come with an explosive casing for brute force situations, and others carry a phosphorescent green liquid that leaks from wounds and allows Hellboy to track his targets. Now, the Good Samaritan does come with a few limitations. A 4-shot capacity is frustrating in the middle of a fight, and Hellboy's right hand of doom, being a massive stone gauntlet, makes reloading a slow and clumsy affair. He usually fires with his left hand out of necessity more than choice. Still, when this gun speaks, things die. Or at least they try to. In the first film, Hellboy uses the Good Samaritan against Samael, the Hound of Resurrection. Samael, who's called the Harbinger of Pestilence and the son of Nergal-Jahad, is no common demon. But Hellboy's bullets manage to kill him, temporarily at least. The creature's resurrection ability makes it harder to keep him down than most.
You woke up the baby.
Big Baby. The Good Samaritan may be epic, but when the situation turns chaotic and gods start tearing through cities, Hellboy ditches subtlety and grabs Big Baby. This weapon is less a gun and more a cannon strapped to a wooden grip. Bigger than the Samaritan in every sense, Big Baby fires oversized shells built for stopping creatures that laugh off regular bullets. In Hellboy II: The Golden Army, when the forest god rises and begins unleashing destruction across the city, Hellboy knows the Samaritan won't cut it, so he reaches for Big Baby, a weapon specifically meant for enemies that won't stay down. Big Baby uses a top brake lever action mechanism and carries a 6-shot cylinder. The gun fires 2 rounds at once, and each shot lands like a small explosive. The exact recipe for the rounds isn't confirmed, but considering Hellboy's preferences, they likely mirror the Samaritan's blend of silver, oak, and holy substances, just supersized. The rounds are heavier, and that added mass means greater momentum, which translates to more force on impact. It's basic physics. More mass equals more mess. Abe Sapiens' design and makeup were a real challenge. Abe Sapiens' design in Hellboy is one of those rare cases where creature effects, puppeteering, and digital augmentation all come together to work like a symphony. His gills, or the fluttering fins on the side of his head, were powered by a surprisingly clever servo system. Mark Satrakian, who had already worked on Samael's tentacles, came up with the tech here as well. Each gill had its own servo, and instead of all flapping together, a radio-controlled circuit board let the movement ripple one by one. It gave the whole structure a slow, organic pulse, and gave the perception of a fish quietly breathing. The eyes were a different story altogether because the makeup fit so tight on Doug's face, there wasn't room to build in blinking mechanisms. So the team handed the job over to Eden FX, who digitally added Abe's blinking, complete with nictating membranes in more than 170 shots. It wasn't just about blinking either. The digital artists also slipped in subtle facial tics to keep him expressive despite the several layers of latex. For Eden FX, this was their first real swing at a feature film, and they pulled it off. The suit itself was mostly old-school prosthetics. From torso and arms up to the elbow to hands and feet, each part had its own use. The hands included those wide fan-like extensions Abe flares out in the lab scenes. Those were animatronic as well. Anytime he needed to show off that splay-fingered motion, the practical hand took over. And interestingly, a fair bit of Doug Jones's own skin remained visible, which was airbrushed so that it would blend with the prosthetic. The water scenes, however, were digital. Tippett Studios scanned a full-sized Abe sculpture and broke out a CG model with a custom muscle rig. Abe's body had to stretch, bend, and twist naturally as he swam with full strokes. Of course, the team studied the creature from the Black Lagoon, frog limb movement, cetacean muscle flow, and of course, Doug's own gestures to make it seem like he flows in water like the most elegant of fish. At the beginning, they didn't know how Samael would look. Samael's final look in the movie actually took a while for the creators to finalize, and the final version came after a long, winding creative process that ran through multiple stages of trial, error, and of course frustration. The earliest take by Konstantin Sakaris gave Samael wings and a squid-like head that hid skeletal jaws. The wings were the first thing to go. What remained formed the base of what would later become Wayne Barlow's biggest design challenge on the film, and presumably the best makeup in the film. Guillermo del Toro didn't want a typical villain, which basically meant no horns and armor. He didn't even want a huge bipedal reptile with glowing eyes. He asked Barlow for something strange and genuinely unsettling, a creature that didn't follow the usual horror monster tropes. In fact, Barlow later said that the brief was part Cthulhu, part sumo wrestler. The creature needed to feel ancient and alien, but still carry physical weight. Tentacles, drooping flesh, bony ridges, and all of that went in and out of rotation. One day it was mandibles, the next it was spines. The only thing that stayed consistent was the odd mix of muscle and bulk, and a sense that this thing shouldn't exist or that it was unimaginable to most humans. Barlow spent weeks reworking sketches. Most of the trouble came from the head, which was proving a bit too complex, too weird, or too far removed from what Del Toro had in mind. And then they hit a wall. As Barlow put it, a dark afternoon of the soul. No sketches were working, nothing clicked, at least that is, until Barlow sat back down and roughed out a brand new head design, working down from there. That new sketch finally gave them direction. It wasn't clean and it wasn't easy, but from that point on, Samael started to take on his final shape as a creature that was equal parts myth, anatomy, and madness. The Behemoth's design. The Behemoth also required a plethora of sketches, redesigns, and anatomical guesswork before the final monster was brought to life. The original brief leaned toward the grotesque. He was an asymmetrical, tentacled mass that felt equal parts otherworldly and, well, just plain wrong. Wayne Barlow, Mike Mignola, and Carlos Huante each brought their own take to the Behemoth's design. But it was Huante's concept, a mix of eel and cephalopod, that was turned into the final form. When Del Toro saw it, his reaction was immediate. That's it. The creature's body stretched like a coiled serpent, studded with black eyes and twitching tendrils. But the real centerpiece was the mouth, also called the snapper. It started as a sphincter-like opening that revealed a set of jaws, complete with their own eyes, which then everted again to show a three-lobed inner mouth. Disturbing? Yes, but perfect for a film that never settled for safe monster design. Jordu Schell sculpted the maquettes, and Steve Wang handled the paint job. However, when the model reached Tippett Studio, the animators hit a roadblock. The maquette wasn't sculpted in a neutral pose, which meant it couldn't be scanned straight into CG. Instead, the entire creature had to be rebuilt digitally from scratch, with the inner mouth scanned separately. Animating the Behemoth brought its own headaches. While the base inspiration came from squid and octopus motion, there was no real reference for what the animators needed. You don't exactly find footage of an octopus flinging a person through the air, said supervisor Todd Labonte, so the team had to act it out with their own arms, frame by frame. Batman killed Hellboy. Hellboy II, The Golden Army, was never supposed to be the end. Del Toro had a trilogy in mind, with a third film meant to cap off Hellboy's story, but the sequel's theatrical release, which was supposed to be an unstoppable force, hit an immovable object, specifically The Dark Knight in its second weekend. The drop in attendance was over 70%, and while the film technically earned more than its predecessor, the profit didn't impress the studio. Interest in a third film faded. Del Toro still held on to the idea, but with other commitments piling up, the project stayed on the shelf. Then, in 2012, Ron Pearlman put the Hellboy costume back on, not for a movie, but for a Make-A-Wish kid. That pushed Del Toro to try to revive the sequel. What followed was 5 years of limbo. Nobody wanted to fund it. The rumored budget of $120 million scared off every major player. Del Toro even considered turning the script into a comic book, but Mike Mignola shot that idea down since Mignola wanted full control over Hellboy's comic canon. In 2016, fresh off the buzz around Deadpool, Pearlman encouraged fans to make some noise. He pushed the hashtag Hellboy III on Twitter, trying to show studios that there was still a demand. A year later, Del Toro did the same and launched a Twitter poll. He promised that if it hit 100,000 votes, he'd meet with Pearlman and Mignola. Over 132,000 people responded, and the objective was pretty much achieved, so the meeting happened. But the good news ended there. Shortly after, Del Toro announced that Hellboy 3 was 100% not happening. Mignola chose to support a reboot instead, one that scrapped Del Toro's ideas and took a more violent, stripped-down approach. That reboot arrived in 2019, fell flat, was rebooted again, and that's the story. Hellboy Silverlance. Before it was axed, Hellboy Silverlance was set to be Abe Sapiens' solo film, a spin-off of the main Hellboy series. Peter Briggs, co-writer of the 2004 Hellboy, was tapped in 2010 to write the screenplay. The idea was to explore Abe's emotional aftermath following Hellboy 2, especially his lingering psychic connection to the late Princess Nuala. The plot would have opened with Abe transferred to the Colorado branch of the BPRD while still dealing with Nuala's death. To find peace, he begins to research her history and and that of her brother, Prince Nuada. This starts a series of flashbacks covering their journeys across the world. Among them were Nuada's first encounters with Mr. Wink in a scene where Nuada crosses paths with Karl Ruprecht Kronen during a visit to Nazi Germany, which would have tied the film into both Hellboy and Hellboy II. Doug Jones was set to return not only as Abe, but also as the Angel of Death. Agent Myers, who was absent from Hellboy 2, would have returned in a supporting role. Hellboy himself would appear in a brief cameo. The plan was to use Silverlance to launch a cinematic universe under the banner from the files of the BPRD, but once the Hellboy reboot was greenlit in 2017, Silverlance was shelved alongside Hellboy 3. Ron Pearlman broke a rib during filming. There are but a few actors who are not afraid of doing their own stunts, and Ron Pearlman is one of them. During the subway scene in the original Hellboy film, Pearlman jumped onto a moving train that was traveling at about 45 miles per hour. Pearlman mistimed the jump and ended up with a broken rib, but the man continued acting. It seems he is just as tough as the character he was playing. The crew only learned about his injury when they saw tears rolling down his eyes, tears of pain. When they asked why it was that he didn't say anything, Pearlman, in peak Hellboy fashion, said, "But it was just one rib. I have lots more." In fact, David Harbour, who played Hellboy after Pearlman, had to go through intense training to get the required physique. It seems like playing Hellboy is no joke. Hellboy is a fanboy of Lobster Johnson, another superhero. Lobster Johnson was first introduced in Hellboy, Box Full of Evil #1, and if you consider the Hellboy universe, he's pretty much Pulp Fiction made flesh. Much like Hellboy, Lobster's existence is unknown to people, and they only know him as a comic book character. In essence, Lobster was a vigilante who operated in secret during the 1930s, often from the sewers under New York, so if Batman had his caves, Lobster had his sewers. He fought both mobsters and supernatural threats with equal efficiency. His usual weapons were a pair of pistols and a burning claw symbol that he marked his enemies with. When his allies were targeted and murdered by the ancient villain Memnon Saw, Lobster made a deal with the US government and soon became a Nazi hunter who fought the Axis forces during World War II. Unfortunately though, he died while trying to sabotage a Nazi rocket launch in Austria, but this being the Hellboy universe, or more accurately, a comic book universe, death was not the end for Lobster Johnson because his spirit lingered on and grew more powerful. Even after his death, Lobster became a pop culture icon. The government allowed, or possibly encouraged, publishers to print his adventures in pulp magazines and adapted them into films. Some believe this was an intentional cover-up to keep the public from figuring out that Lobster had been a real agent of the US government. Hellboy, who grew up reading those pulps, eventually encountered the ghost of his childhood hero in the ruins of the same Austrian castle where Lobster had died. This is how Hellboy respected his friend Roger. In Hellboy Conqueror Worm #4, the star is no longer Big Red, but another unsung BPRD hero, Roger the Homunculus. Born from blood, herbs, and a steaming vat of horse manure, Roger doesn't sound like much at first, but in this issue, he pretty much stops the world from ending. The Conqueror Worm, an ancient being summoned by Nazi madman Hermann von Klempt, arrives on Earth with a typical comic booky plan to scorch the planet and call down its siblings, the Ogdru Hem and the Ogdru Jihad. Hellboy throws everything he has at the creature, including a grenade, but nothing works. As the situation escalates, Roger remembers something that the ghost of Nazi hunter Lobster Johnson once told him. He tells Hellboy that he can absorb the worm's essence into his own body and contain it. Hellboy hesitates, but Roger doesn't even wait for permission. He acts, and all Hellboy can do is watch and admit that Roger was a true hero. Even after Roger contains the worm, the fight isn't over. Klempt, who is now reduced to a head riding a tiny robotic body, tries to free the worm from within Roger. Rather than letting that happen, Roger grabs Klempt and hurls himself off a cliff, willing to die to stop the monster. It almost kills him, but with some spectral assistance from Lobster Johnson, Hellboy finishes off the Conqueror Worm and revives Roger's limp body. He almost became a DC hero. So it wasn't just the appearance that kept changing for Hellboy from his inception. Turns out, his publishing house was also a subject of change because he was initially pitched to DC Comics, who loved the idea behind the character, but weren't particularly happy about his name. And, we can't really blame them because the guy did have the word hell in the name. Yes, DC is the den of several dark characters, and their comic books have a way of handling them, but the name Hellboy was always going to be a hiccup for them, which just wasn't the case for Dark Horse, who opened their arms to Hellboy and embraced him like one of their own. And let's be honest, Dark Horse was a much better home for Big Red. Nevertheless, DC did publish a crossover in Batman/Hellboy/Starman, a 2-issue miniseries. No one could wield the right hand of doom better than Pearlman. One of the things that defines Hellboy is his right hand of doom, that big, powerful hand that can do wonders. It was actually given to him by his demon father after he chopped off Hellboy's real right hand for good. Now, the right hand of doom is very important to Hellboy because he can't afford to let anyone else use it. It's like a nuke that needs to be protected, or else someone else would use it and create havoc. Now, pragmatically speaking, any actor would have difficulties doing most things because his right hand was practically tied behind his back while playing Hellboy. This is where Ron Pearlman came in handy because he's a lefty, and that solved that problem. The Star Wars influence. The troll market scene in the second Hellboy movie was actually inspired from a certain cantina scene from Star Wars. I mean, it's definitely a hive of scum and villainy if you think about it. Now, that's all we got for you this time, but we would love to hear from you if you've got any obscure Hellboy facts rattling around in your mind that you want to share. Please, please, please leave those in the comments section down below. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.